Honestly, Michael, you've become such a burden. Your father and we're not getting any younger, you know? We can't be expected to support a grown man indefinitely. The words delivered by my mother, Beatrice, with a sigh of theatrical weariness, hung in the air of the chintz-filled living room that had been my childhood home, a room I had, for the past 6 months, been forced to re-inhabit after a rather brutal and entirely unexpected corporate downsizing had eliminated my position as a senior logistics manager. My name is Michael Sterling, 49 years old, and until that moment, I had naively believed that my temporary return to the family nest, while certainly a blow to my pride, was a matter of familial support, a temporary port in a sudden storm. My mother's pronouncement, however, made it chillingly clear that my status had been downgraded from son to unprofitable liability. My father, Arthur, a man whose conversational style usually consisted of a series of disapproving grunts from behind his copy of the Financial Times, chimed in with his own brand of paternal encouragement. "Your mother's right, son," he'd mumbled, not bothering to lower his newspaper. 49 years old and back in your old room. It's not a good look. Your brother, Richard, now he's a success. Partner at his accounting firm. 2 cars. A membership at the golf club. That's what a man of your age should be aiming for. Richard, my younger, more outwardly successful brother, the golden child, the one who had followed my father's prescribed path of conservative, predictable corporate achievement. The one whose life was a constant, unspoken, and often spoken rebuke to my own, more unconventional career path. Before my redundancy, my work in international logistics had taken me all over the world, a life of complex problem-solving, of navigating cultural and political minefields, a life I had found deeply challenging and rewarding. To my father, however, it had always been a source of suspicion, a career that lacked the solid, reassuring, and most importantly, local prestige of Richard's accountancy practice. I looked from my mother's martyred expression to the top of my father's newspaper, and a cold, hard resolve began to form within me, a resolve as unyielding as the bedrock upon which a well-planned warehouse foundation is laid. For 6 months, I had endured their sighs, their pointed comments, their thinly veiled disappointment. For 6 months, I had lived in this house, a house I had, over the years, contributed to significantly, both financially during my more prosperous times and physically, overseeing renovations, managing repairs, ensuring its long-term stability, all while my parents enjoyed their comfortable retirement. They seemed to have forgotten that. They seemed to believe that their ownership of the property was absolute, their right to pass judgment on me, their burdensome son, unquestionable. They were about to receive a rather significant lesson in the finer points of property law and the often overlooked details of a well-drafted family trust. What my parents, in their smug, self-satisfied certainty, did not know, what they had clearly forgotten in the fog of their own entitlement, was a small but crucial detail about the ownership of this very house, this stage for my public humiliation. 20 years prior, at my own quiet insistence, and with the help of my astute and thankfully very discreet solicitor, Alastair Finch, my financially significant contribution to a major extension and renovation of the property had been legally formalized. Not as a gift, not as a loan, but in exchange for a majority share in the ownership of the house, an ownership that was held, not in my name, but within a discreetly established blind trust, for which I was the sole beneficiary, and whose existence I had never seen fit to mention to my parents or my brother. They believed they were living in their house, graciously tolerating their disappointing, unemployed son. They had no idea they were, in fact, tenants in my house, their right to reside there contingent entirely on my goodwill. A goodwill that, as of this afternoon's pronouncement, was rapidly and irrevocably evaporating. I took a slow, deliberate breath, my mind, trained to manage complex logistical chains, already mapping out the next series of moves, the precise sequential steps required to execute a rather comprehensive change of ownership and occupancy. "You're right, mother, father," I said, my voice calm, almost cheerful, a tone that seemed to momentarily disconcert them. You shouldn't have to bear this burden a moment longer. In fact, I've been thinking a great deal about my future and about making some significant changes. I promise you, by this time next month, your burden will be well and truly lifted, in ways you can't even begin to imagine." My mother beamed, a look of relieved self-satisfaction spreading across her face. She clearly interpreted my words as a promise to find a job, any job, and move out. My father merely grunted, a sound of dismissive approval. They had no idea what I truly meant. They had no idea that the for sale sign that would be hammered into their perfectly manicured lawn in precisely 2 weeks' time would not be a sign of my desperation, but a declaration of my independence and a final, unassailable resolution to the long-standing and deeply unbalanced ledger of our family's accounts. The burden was indeed about to be lifted, but it was they, not I, who were about to be cast adrift. The quiet, failed son was about to execute a corporate restructuring of his own, and the primary asset, the family home, was about to be liquidated, with its majority shareholder, me, reaping the benefits. The history of my financial relationship with my parents and with this house was a long and, from my perspective, deeply inequitable one. My father, Arthur, for all his bluster about fiscal responsibility and the virtues of a proper career, had a surprisingly checkered history of poor investments and ill-advised business ventures in his younger years. My mother, Beatrice, while not extravagant, had a taste for a certain level of comfort and social status that their own resources could not always comfortably sustain. I, on the other hand, had done well in my logistics career. The international assignments, while a source of paternal disapproval, gallivanting around the globe, Michael, instead of settling down and building something solid, had been exceptionally lucrative. And I, unlike my father, had been a prudent, conservative investor. Over the years, I had quietly, and without fanfare, become the family's unofficial financial backstop. There had been the loan to my father, never repaid, to cover the losses from his disastrous investment in a friend's alpaca breeding scheme. There had been the substantial gift to my parents to pay off their mortgage a decade early, a gesture they had accepted as their due, a simple fulfillment of successful sons' filial duty. And then there had been the house itself. About 15 years ago, they had decided they wanted to build a large, modern extension, a new sunroom, an expanded kitchen, a master suite with a walk-in wardrobe for Beatrice's extensive and largely unworn collection of formal hats. The project was well beyond their means. I, at the time enjoying a particularly prosperous period in my career, had offered to fund it, but not, as they had assumed, as another outright gift. I had learned from my father's alpaca-related amnesia. This was a significant investment, and I was at heart a logistics man, a man who understood the importance of clear, documented contractual agreements. I had consulted my solicitor, Alastair Finch, a man whose understanding of trust law was as profound as his distrust of informal family financial arrangements. On his advice, we had structured the deal with a quiet, legal elegance. I would fund the entire renovation, a sum well into 6 figures, and in return, my parents would transfer a 60% majority ownership stake in the property into a blind trust, the Nightingale Trust, for which I was the sole and anonymous beneficiary. To them, the paperwork, drafted by Alastair with a deliberate, almost soporific complexity, had simply been a formality, a way for me to manage my tax liabilities. They had signed it with barely a glance, their minds focused on the far more exciting prospect of choosing granite countertops and bathroom fixtures. They had, in essence, sold me a controlling interest in their home, and had then, over the years, promptly, and with a breathtaking lack of curiosity, forgotten all about it. They continued to live in the house, to treat it as their own, and I, content in my own life, my own career, had never seen any reason to disabuse them of that notion. The trust was a quiet, long-term security measure, a contingency plan against some future, unforeseen eventuality. An eventuality that, it now seemed, had arrived in the form of my own redundancy and their subsequent, and rather callous, reclassification of me as a burden. My brother, Richard, had, of course, been entirely absent from these earlier financial arrangements. His own career, while respectable, had never yielded the kind of disposable income that would have allowed him to contribute to our parents' various lifestyle enhancements or financial misadventures. He had, however, been a very vocal and enthusiastic supporter of their expenditures, particularly when they were funded by me. He had applauded their decision to build the extension, had openly admired its luxurious appointments, and had never, not once, questioned the source of the funds that had made it all possible. His role in the family dynamic was a simple one: to be the successful, approved-of son, a role that required little of him financially but granted him a great deal of unearned moral authority, an authority he often wielded with a subtle but persistent condescension against me. Now, as I sat in my small workshop, the scent of wood and oil a comforting balm to my frayed nerves, I began to formulate the precise, sequential steps of Project Nightingale. The name, a private joke between me and Alistair, was a nod to the quiet, almost invisible power of a song heard only when the time is right. The first step, already taken, had been to instruct Alistair to prepare for the immediate dissolution of the Nightingale Trust and the formal transfer of the property title into my personal name. A process that would be legally straightforward, if, for my parents, emotionally cataclysmic. The second step would be to engage a reputable and preferably rather aggressive real estate agent to list the property for sale. I wanted a quick, efficient transaction. I was not interested in a protracted, emotional negotiation with potential buyers. This was a business decision, a liquidation of an underperforming and now rather toxic asset. The third and most delicate step will be the formal notification to the property's current, non-paying, and entirely unsuspecting tenants, my own parents. Alistair would handle this, of course. He would draft a formal, legally binding letter, informing them of the change in ownership and the impending sale of the property, and providing them with a generous, but firm, 60-day notice to vacate the premises. The letter would also, as a gesture of, well, if not goodwill, then certainly of a certain ironic magnanimity, include a cashier's check for a sum sufficient to cover the deposit and first few months' rent on a comfortable, if considerably more modest, two-bedroom retirement apartment, a property Alistair's firm had already discreetly identified in a very respectable, if entirely unglamorous, nearby community. And finally, there was the matter of my brother, Richard. I decided, let him learn of these developments not from me, not from Alistair, but from our frantic, hysterical parents. He had, for so long, enjoyed the comfortable position of the uninvolved, morally superior observer. He was about to be dragged, headfirst, into the messy, practical consequences of his family's long-standing arrogance and greed. My father had called me a burden, a failure. He had compared me unfavorably to my successful, respectable brother. He had no idea that my failure had been a period of quiet, focused, and highly lucrative reinvention. And he certainly had no idea that his successful son, Richard, was about to be faced with a rather significant and entirely unexpected new financial responsibility: the long-term housing and care of his suddenly dispossessed, and I suspected, deeply indignant parents. The logistical chain of events was in motion. The pieces were all in place. The quiet, redundant manager was about to execute the most satisfying and most personal supply chain reorganization of his entire career. The 2 weeks following my no-problem email to my father were a period of intense, behind-the-scenes activity, a quiet, methodical preparation for the impending storm. Alistair Finch, my solicitor, moved with his usual brisk efficiency, finalizing the dissolution of the Nightingale Trust and the formal transfer of the house title into my name. The legal paperwork was, as he had assured me, ironclad, the chain of ownership clear and indisputable. Meanwhile, I engaged the services of a real estate agent Alistair had recommended, a woman named Eleanor Vance, known for her aggressive marketing strategies and her talent for securing quick, high-value sales. Eleanor, a sharp, no-nonsense professional with a keen eye for a property's potential, was delighted with the listing. A house of this quality in this neighborhood? Michael, she'd said, her eyes gleaming with a predator's appreciation for prime real estate. We'll have offers before the for sale sign is even properly in the ground. The market is hot right now. We agreed on a listing price that was ambitious, but given the quality of the renovations I had funded years ago, entirely realistic. The professional photographer was booked, the glossy brochures prepared, the online listing drafted, all ready to go live on a date of my choosing. During this period, I maintained a facade of quiet, almost penitent compliance at my parents' house. I was the model of a dutiful, if somewhat down-on-his-luck son. I mowed the lawn. I repaired a leaky faucet in the guest bathroom. I endured my father's monologues on the decline of modern industry and my mother's endless, passive-aggressive inquiries about my job search. I offered no hint of the storm that was about to break. My brother, Richard, called once, his tone a mixture of condescension and a certain grudging, brotherly concern. "Her dad kicked you out of the reunion, Mike," he'd said, his use of my old nickname a familiar, if now irritating, attempt at intimacy. Tough break, but you know how he is. All about appearances. Listen, if you need a few quid to tide you over, I could probably float you a small loan. Just until you get back on your feet. The offer, so patronizing, so perfectly illustrative of his own and my parents' perception of me as a charity case, was almost too much to bear. But I simply and politely declined. "Thank you, Richard," I'd said, my voice even. "But I have things under control. I'm pursuing a new venture, actually. Something artisanal. You wouldn't be interested." "Artisanal," he'd echoed, a note of amused disbelief in his voice. "Gaga, Michael. First logistics, now. Artisanal whittling? Well, whatever keeps you busy, I suppose. Just try not to be too much of a burden on Mom and Dad, eh? They're not getting any younger." "Don't worry, Richard," I'd replied, a smile in my own voice that he had clearly misinterpreted as one of sheepish gratitude. "I have no intention of being a burden on them for much longer. In fact, I'm in the process of ensuring their long-term security right now." The day finally arrived. The for sale sign, a large, glossy, and unapologetically prominent affair bearing the logo of the city's most aggressive real estate firm, was hammered into the pristine front lawn of my parents' house at precisely 8 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. I was not there to witness the event, of course. I was several miles away, in my workshop, putting the finishing touches on a particularly intricate automaton, a mechanical scribe that could, with astonishing precision, pen a perfect copy of a Shakespearean sonnet. But I had arranged, with a certain ironic flair, for a friend with a drone to capture the moment on video. The footage he sent me later that morning was spectacular. It showed my father, Arthur, emerging from the house in his dressing gown to retrieve the morning paper, his expression one of sleepy, self-satisfied complacency. His eyes then fell upon the sign, and he froze, his jaw dropping, the Financial Times fluttering unheeded from his grasp. My mother, Beatrice, then appeared at his side, her hand flying to her mouth in a gesture of classic theatrical horror. They stood there, two stunned, bewildered figures on the manicured lawn of a house they had, just moments before, believed to be their unassailable domestic fortress. The second phase of the operation was deployed an hour later. A legal courier, dispatched by Alastair Finch, arrived at their door, delivering a thick, official-looking envelope. The letter inside, which Alastair had allowed me to co-author, was a masterpiece of polite, unyielding legal prose. It informed them of the recent change in the property's legal ownership, a consequence of the dissolution of a long-standing private trust of which I was the sole beneficiary. It formally notified them of my intention to sell the property and provided them with a legally mandated 60-day notice to vacate the premises. And it concluded by informing them that, as a gesture of my continued, if perhaps unappreciated, filial concern, a separate trust had been established in their name, funded by a portion of the anticipated proceeds from the sale, a trust that would provide a generous monthly stipend sufficient to cover the lease on a comfortable, if considerably more modest, two-bedroom retirement apartment. and to ensure their long-term care and financial security, provided, of course, that they complied fully and without protest to the terms of the notice to vacate. It was in essence an eviction notice and a retirement plan, all rolled into one neat, legally binding package. I had not just sold the house out from under them. I had also, with a certain cold, actuarial precision, provided for their future, but on my terms, a future that would be secure, yes, but one that would be conspicuously devoid of the kind of financial autonomy that had allowed them to so casually and so cruelly fund my brother's successes while deriding my own. Their first call, predictably, was not to me, but to Richard. The drone footage, had it continued, would likely have captured a scene of frantic, hysterical communication, the golden child being summoned to deal with the sudden, inexplicable rebellion of the family's designated failure. The burden, as I had promised my mother, had indeed been lifted. But the nature of that lifting and the new burdens it was about to place on my esteemed brother were something they were only just beginning to comprehend. The quiet, useless son had just executed a flawless logistical maneuver, a comprehensive and hostile takeover of his own family's primary asset. And the shock waves, I knew, were just beginning to spread. Richard's arrival at my parents' house, or rather my house, later that afternoon, was, from all accounts, provided with a certain grim satisfaction by my drone-piloting friend, who had remained on discreet standby, a scene of high domestic drama. He had apparently sped from his downtown accounting firm, his face a mask of furious disbelief, clearly intending to take charge, to sort out this ridiculous misunderstanding, to put his wayward and clearly delusional older brother firmly back in his place. He had found his parents in a state of near hysterics, my mother weeping into a series of silk cushions, my father pacing the living room, his face a mottled shade of puce, the solicitor's letter clutched in his trembling hand. Richard, after a brief and reportedly rather loud conference with our parents, had then immediately tried to call me. I had, of course, not answered. My phone, as per Alastair Finch's explicit instructions, was off, my own location a quiet, undisclosed workshop far from the epicenter of the storm I had so deliberately unleashed. His subsequent calls had, therefore, been directed to Alastair's office, where he had been met with the same polite, impenetrable wall of professional detachment that my father had encountered the previous week. Mr. Sterling, Alastair's formidable paralegal, had reportedly informed him, "Mr. Finch is in conference and unavailable to speak with you at this time. However, I can confirm that his client, Mr. Michael Sterling, the legal and beneficial owner of the property in question, stands by the terms of the formal notice delivered to Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Sterling this morning. All future communications regarding this matter should be directed to us in writing." The phrase legal and beneficial owner, a piece of precise legal jargon Alastair had insisted upon, had, I was told, caused Richard to sputter with a rage that was almost comical in its impotence. The idea that I, his failed older brother, could be the legal owner of their cherished family home was a concept so alien to his understanding of the natural order of things that he seemed unable to process it. The next few days were a flurry of legal posturing from Richard's side. He engaged his own solicitor, a rather slick corporate lawyer named Thorne, a name that, I was beginning to realize, seemed to be a recurring motif in tales of familial avarice and legal overreach, who sent a series of increasingly threatening letters to Alastair. They challenged the validity of the Nightingale Trust. They questioned the legality of the property transfer. They even, in a particularly desperate and ill-advised move, hinted at challenging my own mental competency at the time the trust was established 20 years prior. Alastair met each of these threats with a calm, almost bored, disdain, his replies a series of meticulously documented refutations, complete with copies of the signed, notarized trust documents, the clear and indisputable land registry records, and a gentle reminder of the rather severe legal penalties for making vexatious and unfounded allegations in a property dispute. It was, as Alastair later described it, like watching a man with a water pistol trying to put out a forest fire. The turning point came about a week later, during a formal meeting between the two legal teams. Richard, his face a mask of sullen resentment, had attended, along with my father, who looked visibly diminished, the usual bluff arrogance replaced by a kind of weary, bewildered anger. Alastair, in his quiet, methodical way, had laid out the unassailable legal facts of the situation. He had then, with a touch of theatrical flair I had come to admire, presented them with a preliminary financial analysis I had prepared, a document that detailed not just the significant capital I had invested in the house over the years, but also a rather comprehensive estimate of the market value of my burgeoning automata and bespoke toy-making business, supported by copies of recent and rather substantial international commission contracts. You see, gentlemen, Alastair had concluded, his gaze sweeping over their stunned, silent faces, your entire perception of my client, Mr. Michael Sterling, appears to be based on a rather outdated and profoundly inaccurate set of data. You perceived him as a burden, a failure, a man without prospects. The reality, as these documents clearly indicate, is that Mr. Sterling is, in fact, a highly successful and entirely self-made, international artisan, whose personal wealth and future earning potential likely far exceed those of certain other members of the Sterling family. The mention of my business, of my quiet, and, as it turned out, extraordinarily lucrative success was a blow from which they never truly recovered. It completely dismantled their primary narrative, the one in which I was the pitiful failure and Richard was the shining star. The foundation of their condescension, their lifelong sense of superiority, had been revealed to be nothing but sand. Richard, according to Alastair, had gone deathly pale. My father had simply stared at the commission contracts, at the 6- and 7-figure sums associated with my silly little hobby, his face a mask of utter, uncomprehending disbelief. Their solicitor, Thorne, after a brief, whispered conference with his clients, had adopted a far more conciliatory tone. The legal challenges were quietly dropped. The focus of the negotiations shifted from a futile attempt to reclaim the house to a rather desperate, and from my perspective, deeply satisfying plea for a more generous interpretation of the terms of the retirement trust one had so magnanimously established for my parents. I, of course, instructed Alastair to remain firm. The terms were the terms. They were generous, they were fair, and they were non-negotiable. They would provide for my parents' comfortable and secure retirement, but they would not fund a lifestyle of unearned luxury or provide a slush fund for Richard's next ill-advised investment. The balance of power and the balance of the family's financial accounts had been permanently and irrevocably recalibrated. As the 60-day notice period drew to a close, the reality of their new situation began to sink in. My mother, Beatrice, was reportedly in a state of near-permanent despair, appalled at the prospect of moving into a poky little 2-bedroom flat. It was, in fact, a spacious and well-appointed apartment in a highly desirable retirement community, but in her eyes, it was a hovel. My father was a study in grim, resentful silence. And Richard was now faced with the undeniable and, from his perspective, deeply inconvenient reality that the long-term care and emotional management of our now dispossessed and deeply unhappy parents was, for the first time in his life, entirely and solely his problem. The burden had indeed been lifted from my parents. It had, with a certain beautiful logistical precision, been transferred directly to my brother. The day my parents moved out of the house was a gray, drizzly, and entirely appropriate November afternoon. I was not there. I had no desire to witness their final, humiliating retreat. I had, instead, instructed the real estate agent, Eleanor Vance, to be present, to formally accept the keys, and to ensure the property was left in a clean and undamaged state. Eleanor called me later that day. "Well, Michael," she said, her voice tinged with a professional satisfaction, "the transaction is complete. Your parents have vacated the premises. A rather somber affair, for what I could gather. Your mother was weeping. Your father just stared at the for sale sign as if it had personally betrayed him. And your brother looked like a man who had just been handed a very large and very unexpected bill." "And the house, Eleanor?" I asked. "Impeccable," she replied, as if they were afraid to touch anything. It seems they have, at last, developed a healthy respect for the concept of other people's property. I hung up the phone, a quiet, profound sense of peace settling over me. The house was mine. The future was mine. The narrative was mine. The quiet, useless son, the burden, had, through a combination of patient planning, quiet industry, and a deep, abiding belief in his own unconventional worth, not only survived, but had triumphed in the most complete and satisfying way imaginable. The family reunion, I reflected with a final, ironic smile, had indeed been a catalyst for a new beginning, just not the one any of them had ever envisioned. The sale of the house, my childhood home, was completed with a brisk, impersonal efficiency that I found deeply satisfying. Eleanor Vance, my aggressive and highly effective real estate agent, secured a price that exceeded even our most optimistic projections, a testament to the quality of the renovations I had funded years ago and the enduring appeal of a well-maintained property in a desirable neighborhood. The proceeds, after the settlement of all associated costs, were transferred to my accounts, a tangible and rather substantial affirmation of my long-held and long-unseen equity. The Nightingale Trust, its primary purpose fulfilled, was dissolved, its assets now firmly and solely under my control. My parents, as planned, moved into the comfortable, if from their perspective, deeply unsatisfactory, two-bedroom retirement apartment. The trust one had established for them provided a generous monthly stipend, more than enough to cover their rent, their bills, their health care, and a comfortable, if not extravagant, lifestyle. It did not, however, provide for my mother's previous level of social entertaining, nor for my father's occasional, and usually disastrous, forays into speculative investment. Their financial wings had been well and truly clipped, their future security now contingent not on their own whims, but on the steady, dispassionate, and entirely non-negotiable terms of a legal document I controlled. My brother, Richard, was now, as I had intended, their primary point of contact, their emotional and logistical support system. The burden of their complaints, their laments, their endless litany of perceived injustices now fell squarely on his shoulders. I heard, through the ever-reliable grapevine of Aunt Agatha, that their frequent, demanding calls were beginning to take a considerable toll on Richard's time, his patience, and indeed, his own marriage. His wife, Cynthia, apparently less than thrilled with her new, unpaid, role as the primary caregiver for her difficult and deeply resentful in-laws. The irony was not lost on me. Richard, the golden child, the one who had always enjoyed all the benefits of familial favoritism with none of the responsibilities, was finally getting a taste of the less glamorous side of being a sterling son. As for me, my life, free from the toxic gravitational pull of my family's expectations and disappointments, began to flourish in ways I had never imagined. My bespoke toy-making and automata restoration business, once a quiet, private passion, became a full-time and increasingly renowned enterprise. I moved out of my small, temporary workshop and purchased a magnificent old stone bar in the countryside, a place with soaring ceilings, ancient oak beams, and a tranquil view of rolling hills. It was the perfect space to create, to build, to dream. Commissions poured in from around the world, from discerning collectors, from luxury brands seeking unique display pieces, from even a few avant-garde theater companies who wanted my mechanical creations for their productions. My work was featured in high-end design magazines, in television documentaries on modern craftsmanship, in exhibitions of kinetic art. I was no longer Michael Sterling, the redundant logistics manager, the useless son. I was now an artist, a master craftsman, a man whose unique and once derided skills were now celebrated, sought after, and very, very well compensated. I found a new companionship, too, a woman named Dr. Eleanor Vance. The coincidence of her name with my real estate agent was a source of ongoing amusement. A brilliant, witty, and deeply kind professor of art history who found my work not silly, but fascinating, a unique fusion of engineering and artistry. She understood my passion, my dedication, my need for quiet, focused, creative solitude. Our life together, In the restored old barn that was now both our home and my workshop was a quiet symphony of shared interests, mutual respect, and easy, comfortable love. About a year after my parents had moved into their new apartment, I received an unexpected and rather stilted letter from my father. It was not an apology, not in the true sense of the word. My father was not a man given to direct admissions of error, but it was an acknowledgement. He wrote about his own father, my grandfather, the cabinet maker, the man he had so often dismissed as a mere tinkerer. He recalled, with a new, almost wistful clarity, the beauty of the things my grandfather had made, the quiet integrity of his craftsmanship. He was a good man, your grandfather, my father wrote, in his crabbed, unfamiliar hand. A man who understood the value of working with his hands, of creating something real, something that lasts. I see a lot of him in you, Michael, more than I ever realized. It was the closest he would ever come to saying he was sorry, to admitting he had been wrong. And for me, it was enough. It was a closing of a circle, a quiet, posthumous reconciliation of sorts, a final, grudging acknowledgement of a different kind of worth, a different kind of success, a success he had spent a lifetime deriding, but could no longer, in the face of all evidence to the contrary, deny. I never did attend another Sterling family reunion. The tradition, it seemed, had died with my parents' residency at the lake house, a casualty of their own arrogance and greed. But I built new traditions, new gatherings in my beautiful old barn, surrounded by my creations, by friends who valued me for who I was, by the woman I loved, and occasionally by a quiet, more thoughtful, younger brother and a subdued, if still somewhat bewildered, pair of parents who were, at last, learning to navigate the unfamiliar terrain of a world that did not revolve entirely around them. The email my father had sent, the one that had been the catalyst for this entire, strange, and ultimately liberating journey, was still saved, buried deep in a digital archive on an old hard drive. I had no need to ever read it again. Its purpose had been served. It had been the unintentional key that had unlocked the door to my own, truer, and far more satisfying life. The burden had indeed been lifted, and I, the man once deemed a failure, had, in the end, inherited the most valuable asset of all, the freedom to be, unapologetically and successfully myself. The years that followed were a testament to the enduring power of quiet, focused work and a life lived with integrity. My business continued to grow. My reputation as one of the world's leading creators of mechanical art solidified. The barn workshop became a place of pilgrimage for collectors, artists, and engineering students, all eager to see the intricate marvels that emerged from my hands. I took on apprentices, passing on the skills my grandfather had taught me, ensuring that the delicate art of automata making would not be lost to a world increasingly obsessed with the ephemeral and the digital. My relationship with Eleanor Vance, the art history professor, deepened into a loving, intellectually vibrant partnership. We traveled the world together, not for corporate meetings, but to explore museums, to visit ancient workshops, to seek out the hidden masterpieces of craftsmanship in every culture. Our home was a sanctuary of shared passions, of books, of art, of the quiet, ticking, whirring life of my mechanical creations. My father and mother lived out their remaining years in the comfortable, if from their perspective, somewhat constrained, security of the retirement trust one had established. Their world shrank, their social influence waned, but in that quiet, smaller life, they seemed to find a measure of peace, a belated understanding of values beyond the superficial. My father, in his final years, even developed a surprising, almost touching pride in my achievements, often sending me newspaper clippings about my exhibitions with a shaky, handwritten note in the margin. "Well done, son." Richard, my brother, after a difficult period of professional and personal adjustment, eventually found his footing. He left the high-pressure world of corporate accounting and started a small, local practice, helping small business owners navigate the complexities of their finances. He seemed happier, less driven by the need for external validation, and our relationship, while never achieving a deep intimacy, settled into a more relaxed, more honest adult friendship. He even, on one memorable occasion, commissioned me to build a small, intricate automaton for his own daughter's birthday, a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement of the world he had once so readily dismissed. One afternoon, many years after the sale of the lake house, an email arrived from my old solicitor, Alistair Finch. It was a brief, almost casual note. He had been contacted by a firm of auctioneers who were handling the estate of the late Beatrice Sterling, my father having passed away 2 years prior. It seemed that among her few remaining possessions of value, they had found a small, locked, antique jewelry box. The key was missing, and they were unable to open it without causing damage. Knowing of my particular skills with intricate mechanisms, they had, through Alistair, requested my assistance. I agreed, more out of a sense of detached curiosity than any lingering familial obligation. A week later, a small, velvet-lined box arrived at my workshop. Inside was the jewelry box, a beautiful, if somewhat tarnished, 19th-century piece with an intricate and clearly very stubborn lock. It took me the better part of an afternoon, working with my finest tools, my most delicate touch, to finally, with a soft, satisfying click, open it. Inside, nestled on faded silk, were not valuable jewels, but a small collection of my own childhood artifacts, things I had long thought lost. A small, carved wooden burr my grandfather had helped me make when I was 7, my first slightly bent school prize medal for mathematics, a faded photograph of me and my mother on a beach, both of us laughing into the sun, a rare, unguarded moment of pure, uncomplicated joy, and, at the bottom of the box, a single, folded sheet of paper. It was a letter in my mother's familiar, elegant script, dated just a few months before her death. "My dearest Michael," it began, "if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and that my foolish pride is no longer an impediment to the truth. The world did not unfold as I had expected, for you or for me. I spent so many years valuing the wrong things, chasing a kind of success that was as empty as it was fleeting. Your father and I, we were wrong. Wrong about you, wrong about Richard, wrong about so much. Your success, your talent, your quiet, unshakable integrity. It was a language we did not understand, and so we dismissed it. That was our failing, not yours." Her words, so raw, so honest, so filled with a belated, heartbreaking clarity, were a final, unexpected entry in the long, complex ledger of our family's history. "You were never a burden, Michael," the letter concluded. "You were a blessing, one we were simply too blind and too foolish to properly appreciate. I hope, wherever you are, that you are happy. You have earned it. With all my love, your mother." I folded the letter, a profound, almost overwhelming sense of closure washing over me. The anger, the hurt, the years of quiet resentment, they all seemed to simply dissolve, replaced by a quiet, compassionate understanding. My mother, in the end, had found her way back to the truth. It had not been about the houses, or the money, or the family reunions. It had been about love, about acceptance, about seeing and valuing your children for who they truly are, not for who you wish them to be. A lesson learned, alas, too late for her, but one that resonated with a powerful and ultimately healing grace. The final discrepancy in the family accounts had, at last, been reconciled, and the balance, a balance of love, of regret, of a final, hard-won understanding, was in its own way perfect,